It's a great American politician, Tip O'Neill, who was Speaker of the House from my state of Massachusetts in America. And he always said, all politics are local. And there's no place more local than the city, because it is the place where we touch with government most often. If we're lucky, we pay our taxes once a year and the federal government leaves us alone. But whether it's water, whether it's waste, whether it's energy, whether it's the transportation to get our children to schools or the schools, the city is our touch point. In the last 3 years, we heard more and more and more about smart cities, smart this, smart energy, smart cities, smart waste, smart environment, smart, smart, smart. And I started to think, God, this is a bit like green. You know, everybody's sticking the label on it because it's some marketing ploy. What does smart city really mean? I'm going to come to a definition that is not linked to innovation and creativity because it's the topic of today's discussion, but because I've spent a lot of time researching and thinking about the subject and working with local governments about how do you really begin to be smart? As Professor Posner showed us today, we live in a small space with, some of the highest density of urban concentration in the world. We can't simply start from the bottom up. Luckily, the new era of smart has helped us to shift our thinking from a smart city being something that the large systems integrators, and I used to work for Accenture, so I have nothing against them. I mean, I didn't like Accenture per se, but I had nothing against the large companies and their big visions. But their big visions were about ripping out ICT infrastructures. If you couldn't mow down Zagreb and rebuild it in a Masdar vision, then at least you could go in and talk to the CIO and say, rip out your ICT infrastructure and plug in ours, and then you'll be smart, and we'll have dashboards and visions and all these high-tech connected points. But again, that's not practical. Anybody that really works in local government isn't practical. And good friends of mine at Microsoft that I talk to a lot about their smart city visions, whenever I say, well, where have you actually done this? When I've talked to IBM, who've been the most, I think, brilliant at their marketing, and I don't mean that in a bad way, because their marketing has been a conceptualization of what a smart city would look like that's practical, they don't come up with any examples. You get a 911 or a 999 phone call system in New York City. You get a cool application in Hong Kong, water management in Aberdeen. But nobody has actually gone into a city from the top down and ripped apart its ICT infrastructure. The new era of the mobile phone, the Android, the apps, has created a different conception of the smart city. The smart city conception of the city as an innovation platform. And I think that this is the most fascinating point for our discussion today in terms of Zagreb as a creative city, in terms of the region, and in terms of how do you start your smart city journey. Not because it's cheap and easy and you get around all of the hard stuff, but because it is a practical, achievable starting point for driving smart innovation within a city that every city can embrace. It's a conception of the city not as an entity that an IBM comes in and replaces one ICT infrastructure with another one, but as a system of operating systems, as a platform of platforms, what Arup had called the urban information architecture. The New York City transport example that I'm using could be done in any European city. As I said, could be done in London. And it started with this concept that I've been talking about, the city as a platform of platforms. And that means you can start anywhere with any new procurement, with any new project where the city has to make an investment. And it's about moving from the old way of investing to a new way of investing, an old way of procuring to a new way of procuring. And in the past, procurements were closed. If you wanted to put hardware to collect information about where the buses are or where the taxis are or where congestion points are or where your waste management trucks are or where your garbage is, any point in a system where your water problems are, you would buy a hardware and a software system from the same vendor, and you would have the same user interface, one point of access. It would be closed, and great. Easy to procure, easy to outsource the problem, therefore potentially easier to manage. What's the problem with that? Well, you've got vendor lock-in, and we all know about that. I would argue it's very, very hard, with all due respect to my friends and colleagues at the big systems integrators. It's not smart to lock yourself into any one vendor, particularly given the pace of change in ICT. You're dependent on that vendor for any problem. You're also dependent on that vendor for creativity, for inspiration, for change, for the new developments that are coming on online, even now as we sit here and speak. So if you move to an open procurement system, what New York City did is it bought the hardware from one vendor and the software from another vendor. And what did that force? That forced the hardware to be open to different points of talking to it. And New York City made the decision to use open source software, which then meant it was open to crowds to come in and improve the software and to work and develop on the software. Now, open source is a difficult and challenging question for local administrators, and I understand that. So it doesn't even necessarily have to be open source software, but open software. Software that is open to third parties coming in and developing. Because when you do that, you open the world to creativity and innovation. Creativity and innovation from the bottom up. Creativity and innovation that is not what the Zagreb Transportation Authority imagines people would want and need, or what the vendors, developers feel like under the terms of the contract, or the money they're getting paid, or the inspiration du jour, or the limitations of the system want to create. But it opens up to what I think is the single greatest asset a smart city, a creative city has, and that's its citizens. Because if you have open application interfaces, it's limitless what can be done. It's not just a question of the private sector doing something. It's not just a question of the transportation sector doing something. It's a question of working with civil society, which we've heard so much about today. What I am suggesting is that moving forward, the single easiest way for a city to start to be smart is to start to think open, is to start to think differently in terms of procurement, to start to think about doing things so that the software is divided from the hardware, so that the software is open to your third parties throughout the city, throughout your communities, to come in and add on to your developments and to create, to start to think differently when you're procuring, the rules of procurement. Open data, data about a city is one of the greatest resources a city has. And yet when you talk to city procurers, most of the old contracts were built in an era before open data was even a concept. So the vendors own the transport data, the vendors own the railroad data, the vendors own the data about energy usage, they own the data about water consumption, they own the data about energy. Simple step, when you start your new procurements, put in a clause, you own the data. And then start working toward opening that system. And if you open the one system, you can start to open the other systems, and it becomes a virtual progress, where a smart city starts to make the connections that matter, the platforms of platforms. And some examples that came out of New York City in terms of the different types of applications and the different types of entrepreneurship that a city can help foster its young developers. So they started to find the newspaper agent, put a timetable, put an electronic timetable that said when the buses were late, if it was near a bus stop. And then suddenly people could stop and get that coffee and get that newspaper because they weren't worried about missing the bus. Another one was a kid who developed a text message system so that people that didn't have smartphones could get the updates about when the buses were late. Because a smart city is a good place to live. A smart city is a happy city. A city that's good and happy to live in is one that listens to its people and pays attention to the things they care about, like not having unreadable and ugly signs all over the place. It means that the creative talent in Zagreb, in Croatia, in the region can scale. Does not have to simply worry about doing something in Zagreb and then redoing it again when they get to Ljubljana and redoing it again when they get to London. It's a platform to facilitate the scaling of creativity and innovation and entrepreneurship. And the last project is a platform that was about how to provide scalability for these entrepreneurs and for these SMEs using the cloud. It's an original conception about public service applications, creating the cloud as an Apple store so that local government doesn't have to constantly re-procure, constantly recreate the wheel, so that transport application developed in Isi Lemolino, you have to rebuild it at home at 5 times the cost. You can go onto this store, the authentication is in place, the procurement rules are in place, and you can download the apps, customize them for your city, and move on. And as I would conclude, what is a smart city? A smart city uses open data, sees the city as the source of all the creative ingredients that go into making our where we live better places to live, sees the citizen as a source of partnership, the citizen being civil society, SMEs, ordinary people in their day-to-day lives, sees the city as the source of partnership, and sees open innovation as the driver of growth. So a city that opens itself up for a platform, opens itself up for partnership, opens itself up for innovation, I believe is smart.